So, hello again and very good afternoon. Oh, very good. Very nice. I hope you've had a lovely day so far, enjoying your sea day. Of course, our final lecture for today and a first lecture for another one of our wonderful enrichment lecturers here on board. I have had a few questions about which side Jan Mayen is going to be on. Just to confirm, it will be on the starboard side of the ship. So if you do want to see that later for the commentary upstairs, of course, you can hang out on the open decks or maybe head to the Explorers or at the back, wherever you like. So on the starboard side of the ship, if you do want to see that later. But right now, of course, we're going to continue to enrich your brains, give you a little bit of feedback for tomorrow as well, just to let you know we will be having our port talk as well on Svalbard. So Longyearbyen, come along for that. That's in the afternoon tomorrow. You can check out the Viking Daily. And of course, as we continue on our journey of enrichment, another fantastic speaker. Once again, like Penny, he was with us all through last voyage, doing another wonderful job on board. He's got multiple lectures. I'm going to continue to encourage you to come along and sit here live. It's always much better. But if you are in your bedrooms, relaxing in bed with a cup of tea and watching the lecture, hello there as well. But right now, ladies and gentlemen, please make him feel very welcome. Put your hands together for our next speaker, Jim Randall.
Well, thank you very much, Damien. And I know this has been such a packed day looking at the daily today that I do appreciate you coming out, or if you're watching on TV, I appreciate you tuning in as well. For those who have accompanied us from New York, it's good to see you back again. For those of you who are new, here from Reykjavik, it's great to see you as well. Just a tiny bit about myself and my background, because I didn't get much of a chance last night in the introduction. I actually trained as an economic and urban geographer and a planner. But the last 12 years of my career, I did something that was, to me, was almost the most rewarding part of my career. I switched from geography because of circumstances to a program called Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island in Eastern Canada. And it was a master's level program. I coordinated that master's program, and I also ran a research institute called the Institute of Island Studies. So they were great programs, and I had a chance to travel the world, research contracts, partnering with other governments and universities around the world. So it was a wonderful opportunity and to actually find out more about islands. I had the opportunity to write a textbook on island studies, and I was fortunate enough to be in a UNESCO chair in island studies and sustainability. The title of this talk, you'll see that it says Arctic Islands. This is actually mostly about Svalbard. Obviously, there's a rich topic about Greenland and geopolitics. I'm not going to talk much about Greenland in this talk because we're steaming towards Svalbard, and so I'm going to focus on it mostly. But I'd be more than happy. I've talked about Greenland before in an earlier talk. I'd be happy to talk about Greenland with you at some time outside of this auditorium. Before I talk about geopolitics in Svalbard, how many of you took part in the Blue Nose Challenge today? Well, congratulations. But I just wanted to say that I did not take part, but as a Canadian, I feel I've paid my dues, and I lived in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, so I really paid my dues. But I wanted to put this slide up here. I had a presentation on Halifax. You know what? Because I know you're now honorary Blue Nosers, but that is a term that is also used for those people living in Nova Scotia, on the coast of Nova Scotia. And they said that the origin of the name Blue Nose is from the maritime tradition. When the sailors got very cold, of course, their noses turned blue. And this picture up here, does anybody recognize this picture? It's the Blue Nose. Any of the Canadians, it's docked in Lunenburg. Well, the next version of it, Blue Nose 2, is docked in Lunenburg, in Nova Scotia. But the Blue Nose 1 was famous. It's on the Canadian dime, but it's famous because it won for 17 years in a row the International Fisherman's Trophy. In the 1920s, there was a race annually between the fishermen from the major ports in eastern Canada and likely Maine, but northeastern United States. And this was a rough and tumble group. These were the sailors. These weren't the America's Cup kind of sailors. And so, because these were working fishing boats, these schooners, and so this boat, the Blue Nose, won 17 years in a row in that race in the 1920s, and that's why it's on the it's symbolic of Canada and on the Canadian dime. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about Arctic islands and the high north in relationship to geopolitics. And what I'm going to start actually a little bit more generally. I'm not going to get too much down into the weeds about what geopolitics is, but I think it's important to understand where this comes from, even more than 100 years ago, to understand what's influencing some of the tensions and or political tensions that exist now in this region. So we'll also look at the role of great or world powers in the region. This road sign is just outside Longyear Bayan. And by the way, Longyear, as Penny mentioned in her talk, if you were at that, is actually the name of the gentleman, the chap who owned the Arctic Coal Company and Mr. Longyear. And Mr. Longyear, for those Americans in the audience, was actually from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Minnesota, called home. And Bayan, of course, is Norwegian for the city. So Longyear, so the city of Longyear. Anybody translate that? What do you think it means in English? Beware of polar bears, of course. So geopolitics, what does that sort of mean? It started probably, the earliest origins is with a British political geographer and a politician by the name of Sir Halford Mackinder. And he wrote a book called The Geographical Pivot of History in the early 1900s. And I want to just read this quote for you. It's up here. It's not a long quote, but he said, "Who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland, and who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world." Now, this is an era before intercontinental ballistic missiles, of course, but I think it's still illustrative of sort of the thinking that existed at the time in this sort of traditional idea of politics as applied to place and space. So Eastern Europe here, and you can sort of make it out here, was considered to be a buffer zone between the great powers of Germany and Russia. And that pivot area that you see in Russia there was then sort of, when we see the writers talking about it, the political scientists, it was changed from the pivot area to the heartland. So after Mackinder, you hear this guy by the name of Nicholas Spikeman started writing. He was a Yale historian who conceived of Europe as a rimland. So you've got a heartland, and you can see Europe around it is considered the rimland, and the rest was considered the maritime periphery. So still in that sort of almost that analogy of the world being an island, and there are places strategically, politically strategically, that are more central and less central. And of course, at the time they're writing, the heartland would be difficult for any army to actually attack, given the armaments that existed at the time. So what is geopolitics? Very simply, the traditional version of geopolitics is just the connections between power, politics, and the characteristics of geography, whether that's your population, the topography, location, size, all of those characteristics of space and place. And so they use that concept of geopolitics traditionally to try to explain political events, whether that's expansionism or strategic battles, those kinds of things, conflicts. Now, let's fast forward 120 years, and people have said that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Sweden and Finland joining NATO along with Norway that had already a member of NATO, and the new maritime routes that potentially could be opened up with the decreasing of the ice pack, the Arctic or the high north has now taken on increased geopolitical significance. And it's sort of one of the, I hate to say this, the pun, but sort of one of the hot spots of geopolitics now. You'll see that I've used the word Arctic and high north now almost interchangeably. And I will be using them almost interchangeably, but if you really want to be technical about it, The high north has a more strategic or geopolitical connotation to it than Arctic. Arctic can be used culturally and in a variety of other ways. So let's go back again. At the start of the 20th century, many of the Arctic islands had a very ambiguous political status. They were a sort of uncertain political status. And in fact, and these islands, I'll mention some of them, I'll talk about them again. So Svalbard, Greenland, Jan Mayen, Franz Josef, Randall Island, they were often referred to in the Latin as terra nullius, or no man's land. And that was a name that was given to any kind of territory that has never been subject to any state. So never really owned by any state, and in most cases never had an indigenous population on it as far as archaeologists were concerned. This drawing, this image here, is a drawing by Gerrit de Veer, a crew member on William Barents's ship, who landed on Svalbard while searching for a northern sea route in 1596. And he describes in his journal, not only was he an artist, but he describes in the journal capturing and killing a polar bear and taking it back to Holland. So except for Greenland, there was really no indigenous population on any of these islands. So after Norway gained independence from Sweden in the early 1905 actually, there was a question of who actually would own Svalbard. And a number of countries were vying to gain ownership or control of it. So Norway, the Netherlands, Russia, the UK all wanted to claim it. After post-World War I in 1920, Norway was awarded Svalbard. Now, why was it Norway as opposed to the others? There's several reasons that are given. First of all, the United States actually had declining economic interest in the area. They really didn't think there was much of economic value in that, so they didn't really care that much about Svalbard. The second was that, recall that in World War I, Norway was a neutral country. And so the Allies wanted to reward Norway for maintaining its neutrality. And finally, the Bolshevik government in Russia had really not been recognized yet, so it really had a very weak claim or ambition to, they might have had a great ambition, but a weak claim to it. So other islands in the Arctic started to be divvied up now about the same time. So you can see the circles and the arrows that I've got pointed here. The Soviet Union was awarded control of Wrangel Island in 1924 and Franz Josef Island in 1929. Canada received control over Sverdrup Islands in 1930, and Norway was awarded Jan Mayen in 1929. And I know Penny in her talk, she mentioned it, and I hope I get a chance to see it as well, Jan Mayen. And if you were at Penny's talk, this is going to be a bit of a repeat, just this one slide. It's a large gravel mine, essentially, and it has a gravel mine, a gravel airstrip. There's a meteorological station on it. But one of the things it does from a geopolitical perspective is it allows Norway to extend its control over the surrounding seabed and sea area, the exclusive economic zone that I'll talk about in this talk and other talks as well. And so it actually, by having control, it's not just the land itself, but it's that at least that 200 nautical miles around it. And that could be very important for strategic reasons, but also for the resources that are on the seabed or the fish that are swimming in the waters in it. Jan Mayen is volcanic, no real permanent residence, and as I said, we'll be passing it in a couple of few hours, and I look forward to seeing it as well. So the big picture in terms of territorial claims in the Arctic and the high north, officially there are 5 territorial claimants to this area. Russia, the United States through Alaska, Canada, Denmark through Greenland, and Norway. There's another 3 states, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, that are also considered Arctic states, but they really don't, if you look at that map, they don't have a claim right up into the North Pole based upon where their mainlands or their islands are located. Because there's no land, obviously, at the North Pole, the territorial claims are important for navigation and resource use. In some cases, The disputes have been resolved already in terms of where the lines are drawn between the various countries. In other cases, they haven't been. So, for example, between Norway and Russia, there have been ongoing disagreements about where that border actually is. And the main problem that exists is not with that 200-mile nautical mile exclusive economic zone, but it's rather, if you look at the law of a convention on the sea, not only does a country control that 200 miles, but it also may control the area beyond it if it's part of a continental shelf. And so that's the problem here, is that the continental shelves go right up, for the plates here, go right up to and past the North Pole. And so there's overlapping claims based upon overlaps in the continental shelf. And in fact, I think Norway, if I'm not mistaken, or is it Denmark, it made a claim that they actually have a claim right into the 200-mile limit of Russia based on their claim. The brown color on this image here is that Denmark versus Russia claims, and the white, just at the white at the sort of the top there, you can see bordering Russia, is a conflict between Norway and Russia. And that's not the only thing that's happening. It's not just up in the North Pole. You also have to look at the fishing rights around these places. And especially given the treaty of the Svalbard Treaty, what rights various nations have to fish in those areas. So this image shows Norway and its fisheries protection zone around Svalbard. And this was determined, Norway determined it, or said, in 1977. So Norway manages this area. It sets the fishing quotas. It determines the methods that can be used for fishing. So you don't have massive trawlers coming in and scooping fish over broad areas. And it also controls vessel access. But it does not have exclusive fishing rights. And as we'll see when we get into the meat of the treaty, why it doesn't have exclusive fishing rights. But I should say here that Russia still doesn't recognize Norway's authority to set this zone, and it has created tension on the high seas between Russia and Norway. I think you may have seen this image before, but I'm going to talk about it in a slightly different way. So Svalbard is actually an archipelago of 9 islands, but only one of them is really inhabited year-round, and that's Spitsbergen. So it's about 650 kilometers, what's that, about 375 to 400 miles from mainland Norway, and about 650 miles or 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole. The total population, I think in 2024 that I looked at, the most recent data I looked at, was about 2,600 people. And almost all of those are in long-year buy-in. There are some people that are often sporadically, maybe not too many permanently, at Ny-Ålesund, the research station, and there are probably around 300 plus or minus Russians at Barentsburg. So long-year buy-in is they claim they're the most northern town in the world. And I mentioned the population being about 2,600 now, and that's increased from about 1,125 in 1990. So it's more than doubled in that period of time, about 30 years. You see, if you look at Svalbard as a whole, there are foreign nationals from over 50 countries on there, and that's largely because of the research station. And those foreign nationals make up at any one time about a third of the population. As is the case with a lot of northern towns and cities, and this happens in Canada and elsewhere, it's a very highly mobile population. And there's estimates that 20 to 25% of the population moves in and out of Svalbard in a given year. And traditionally that was because of the mining activity. So the contracts, the miners, they wouldn't be there on a long-term permanent basis. But now it's, even in terms of tourism now, obviously there's not much need for permanent settlers there in the winter. There aren't many tourists coming up into Svalbard in the middle of January and February. But this is also where you see Norway starting to express its control in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. Norway is trying to encourage more families to come here and settle permanently, and because therefore it gives greater stability and greater claim for Norway. And you would think that the treaty might give it a claim, but the other nations always pushing against the terms of that treaty. And in fact, one of the things that Norway has done recently has put in place a new voting rules. So they were changed in 2022, and they are now that non-Norwegians can only vote in the local elections if they've lived there for at least 3 years. So in the 2023 elections on Svalbard, of the 2,600 residents, only about 1,420 were eligible to vote. So right away you can see in a subtle, not so subtle way how Norway is trying to control things. But I should add as well that as soon as you start opening up local democracy and local governments, they can be messy creatures as well. You have to be careful that that your central control of whatever takes place might be messed up by some of the decisions of the people that actually live there on a permanent basis. These two pictures, the one image up above is the Russian mining town of Barentsburg, and down below is the former mining housing in Longyearbyen. And a little bit about Svalbard in terms of its terms. It comes from the Old Norse, meaning cold shores or cold coast. Like the Faroes and Iceland, there weren't any indigenous people on it as far as we know. And in fact, it's noted in the sagas, the Viking sagas, as early as 1194 AD. Originally, it was called Spitsbergen, and Spitsbergen actually means sharp-pointed mountains in Dutch. And so it was called this by the Dutch explorer William Barents in the 16th century, and we know Barents now from the Barents Strait. And I mentioned that Longyearbyen was named after John Longyear from the Arctic Coal Company, and founded in 1906. And he sold it actually to Norway in about the late 19-teens. As I said, after World War I, Norway was granted sovereignty over this. But now let's go towards World War II. And we have a situation here, and I think Penny showed a slide of the coal mines being blown up, where the Allies, mostly Canadian, by the way, coincidentally, had an operation they called Operation Gauntlet. And the purpose of the objective of the operation was to destroy the German communications center that was here and blow up the coal mines, and then also evacuate all the Norwegians and the Russians that were there. And they did this because they were afraid that Nazi Germany was going to use this largely, and not necessarily as a military base, but as a meteorological base, so that they could find out what the weather conditions were like in advance for battles that might take place in Europe. So that was the reason why they wanted to take it over and blow up the telecommunications, not necessarily because of its specific strategic importance in that area, but because of the information it was able to give the Germans in terms of upcoming battles in Europe. Until recently, all the settlements in Svalbard were really company towns, coal mining towns. And the companies that ran them, including Store Norsk, and Store, by the way, just is Norwegian for great. Store Norsk had really de facto control over population. And I should say this is no different than exists in many company towns in northern Canada and probably many other in Alaska and elsewhere. So they controlled who lived there, what work they did, what goods they could purchase, and so on. And this image here you can see in Longyearbyen is Norwegian. The Norwegian currency actually only emerged in 1980. Before that, the company town actually had its own script. So wages were paid in this script, and you bought things from the canteen and other places, the company canteen in this script. So this is an image of the Norwegians and Russians being evacuated. The economy of Svalbard, historically, it was used for whaling, and so you see this image here of whalers. So the Dutch, the British, the Germans used it as a whaling camp, and then it was also in the 18th and 19th century used by the Russians and Norwegians as a hunting grounds. From the start of the 20th century, coal mining was the main economic activity there. and it was really a company town. Now, as you may have already heard, actually the coal mines were probably rarely very profitable, and they're not profitable now, and they've virtually been abandoned because of distance and production costs and everything else. So what Norway and Svalbard is trying to do is increase and diversify their economy and open it up to tourism. I should say, as we'll find out in just a moment, they have to be careful because of the terms of the treaty. As soon as you allow other activities, that means every other nation that is I shouldn't say has a presence, the nationals that are present there can also do that. So if the Norwegians didn't open up tourism, that means other countries couldn't open up tourism. So you have to be careful about what you undertake here. But prior to the 1980s, there was no accommodation, no dining facilities, no shopping at all. So Norway is trying to encourage tourism by building hotels and restaurants and shopping. Finally, there is fishing here, and there is ongoing fishing, but there's no processing on it. And in fact, all of the processing that takes place on mainland takes place in mainland Norway. Now, Norway, the government is actually considering developing a small-scale processing facility just for the local tourists and the local population on Longyearbyen. So diversification of the economy is a strategy that you're using to try to diminish the Russian influence, but it does run the risk of more state actors and also that of local democracy that might run at odds with whatever central government in Norway might want. The Norway philosophy, or the Norway adage here, and I've got it in yellow, is that they're trying to change Svalbard from being a principle to being a place. So the Svalbard Treaty that I mentioned, signed in 1920 in Paris, it was originally called the Spitsbergen Treaty because it wasn't called Svalbard at the time. And there are currently 46 countries that are signatories to the treaty, including the USSR in 1924. The objectives of the treaty are, first of all, to settle the question of sovereignty once and for all, and secondly, to ensure that foreign nationals, individuals and companies, not states, but foreign nationals as individuals, could still enjoy economic privileges, and that also includes scientific research privileges. The most important terms of the treaty, or the three important terms of it. The first is that Norway can't treat foreign individuals any differently than they treat their own Norwegian individuals. Now, you might add, well, what about the local voting rules? Doesn't that do it? So there's all kinds of machinations going on here. The second is taxes can only be used for local purposes. And the third is that islands can't, the islands in the archipelago can't have a naval base, fortifications, or be used for quote-unquote maritime or warlike purposes. So, but you can tell warlike purposes is a pretty subjective term. What does that actually mean? And nations are, as I say, pushing the boundary of what that means. So you can see this is actually a Norwegian frigate here as well in Longyearbyen Harbor. So there's a lot of misunderstandings out there, and some of them are intentional misunderstandings about what those terms actually give people and states the right to do and not do. The first misunderstanding, people have a question, is Svalbard's legal status as a shared space ambiguous? And in fact, the treaty is very clear that no, it is not ambiguous. It's clear that Norway has sovereignty over all of the islands and all of the land on that islands. So no state has seriously questioned that treaty except, and I'll get to this in a moment, Russia had tried to negotiate with Norway after World War II a bilateral relationship, but Norway rejected their overtures. Why would they go into it? The second one is, well, how do you define warlike purposes in the treaty? And people have said, well, is that the same as a demilitarized zone? And the answer is no, it's not the same as a demilitarized zone. There actually you can't have military activity, and so long as it is not warlike. So, in other words, no naval bases or fortifications. But Norway, through NATO, does have an annual, the frigate and other ships do come up here, and theoretically you could probably have a radar station on here, because it could justify it as being a non-warlike type of purpose for the the satellite base. So that's a frigate that I say. And the third misunderstanding for the treaty is, do states have rights under the treaty? And the answer is no. States do not have rights under the treaty. Only individuals, as I mentioned earlier, or companies, or citizens, or companies of the signatory nations actually have any rights. So there's no such thing as other countries having a presence. It's important because I've even almost loosely said that already in this talk, that other countries have a presence in it. According to the black and white terms of the treaty, it's impossible for other countries or states to have a presence there because it's sovereign territory of Norway. So let's go back and have a reminder of some of these territorial claims here, and then find out what's going on both with Russia and China as specific actors in the area. So this is a different image of the overlap in territorial claims of the extended continental shelf. And you can see why it gets so confusing, because the continental shelf extends from all of those plates, from all of those countries. So you have overlapping claims between Russia and Denmark, between Norway through Svalbard and Russia, and between Canada and Russia. The U.S. is not listed here, but it actually, if you look at it, it's that wedge-like place where you have Arctic Ocean on it. That's sort of the American sector here. Disagreements, as I said, are largely based on those interpretations of continental shelves. Now, in an ideal world, they would submit to the UN Commission on the limits of the continental shelf. But that commission has not been operating since the invasion of Ukraine. And so everything is in limbo right now in terms of who does what. So let's now look at Russia's interest in the Arctic. And you can see from this map, I won't go in the details here, but Russia has a significant presence throughout the Arctic in terms of its military bases. And remember now that this is not a Norway-Russia issue. This is a NATO-Russia issue. Because if it was a Norway-Russia, Norway wouldn't have a chance. I hate to say that, but it wouldn't have a chance given the military might in the Arctic of Russia. So this is really a NATO-Russia kind of issue. And there's been tension now since 2014, since the invasion of Crimea. And that's escalated even further with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And I'll give you some examples of how that tension has played out over the last few years. There have been clashes between the Norwegian Coast Guard and the Russian Navy, not with any ships sunk or people killed, but there are a lot of ways you can have clashes on the high seas without cutting in front of ships, those kinds of things. There's also, some of you might remember that there was this cutting of cable, a fiber optic cable between Svalbard and the mainland of Norway. No one has still proven conclusively who did it, but one of the cables, the fiber optic cables that actually also controlled internet and telecommunications, was cut between those two places in January 2022, and nobody, as I say, has claimed responsibility for it. And another example of the tension is that Russia has been fishing within that 200-mile limit within Svalbard, and they're supposed to allow Norwegian monitors on the board in order to make sure that they're abiding by whatever Norway has said are the rules regarding fishing. But Russia is not allowing monitors on there. So not only does Norway not know how much fish they're taking, they don't even know what actually is taking place on those ships. So you don't know whether they might be used as satellite or some other military purpose on the ships too. And obviously there has been no dialogue over the last 3 years between Svalbard, Russia. And the Russia objective is, by the way, is not necessarily to actually gain control of Svalbard, but to sow ambiguity, to sow uncertainty. So if you can do that, I think they're trying to play sort of a long game here in terms of their interest in the area. And talking about the long game, Russia has had a long-term interest in there. They purchased the mining company, mining town, was at one point was sort of a Dutch mining town in Barentsburg in 1902, and then the Russians purchased that in 1932. So, like Norway, if you had figures on profitability, you'd probably say it's not very profitable. But obviously, there are other reasons for having people there. And although Russia is a signatory to the Svalbard Treaty, it's never really been happy with the outcome of that right now. And as I say, Russia, after World War II, tried to get a bilateral agreement with Norway, but Norway refused to do it. I should say as well that Russia is also shifting to tourism at Barentsburg, and also have visits to the abandoned coal mining community of Pyramiden as well. In the early 21st century, the Russians actually were cooperating very closely with Norway on Svalbard. And there were high hopes at the time for cooperation, especially in Svalbard, but in other areas in the high north. In fact, in some of the position papers that Norway put out at the time, you see this phrase called high north low tension being used. So that implies that there's a greater degree of cooperation regarding the activities between nations there. And of course, that 2014 annexation of Crimea was a turning point, and that became even more problematic in 2022. So since 2022, in fact, before that, you could actually go to some of Barentsburg or Pyramiden and act as tourists, and you can't go now. No Norwegian tour company would even think of bringing non-Russian tourists in that area, just because you just don't want to take the chance. And remember that I said that all places are supposed to be treated as sovereign Norwegian territory, and they're not supposed to be a state presence there. Well, look at this diagram, this picture down on the bottom right-hand side there. That looks a little state-like, institutional-like, doesn't it? This is a parade of Russian vehicles, helicopter, men in uniforms at Barentsburg in May of 2023. Technically, as I say, the state presence is not supposed to be allowed. Since then, Norway has been using the treaty to exert control and try to marginalize Russia in a variety of ways, and I already mentioned sort of one or two of them. The other one is they're trying to encourage more researchers, not only from Norway, but from other countries to go there. And what that does is not only does it dilute the presence of Russian researchers, but it also allows Norway to make a claim that they need to be a coordinating presence. Because there's so many people there from so many different places, you need to have a coordinator. And so they would take that role of coordinator. There is that, I think I mentioned there's an international scientific research station there, and it's a very active one under the treaty. However, Norway regulates it. There is a broad international body that approves it, but ultimately Norway regulates that. And it's based on individual researchers, not states. Now, over time, however, nations have tried to use their buildings as almost as missions, as political missions. This image in the bottom left here is at the Ny-Ålesund research station. And they could have up to, not only there, but in that community, up to 1,000 scientists and others from over 30 countries during that summer research season. And it's largely natural sciences, scientific research, by the way. But there is a lot of state posturing. And as I say, sometimes they even call their buildings, leased buildings, missions. This image at the top right is actually the Yellow River Research Station, where many of the Chinese researchers stay. And you can see there are two Chinese marble lions, actually almost eerily similar to those you'd find outside of Beijing government buildings, outside this research station. So imagine that happened. China had leased this building as a former mining building, and then had these lions shipped all the way up here to Svalbard to put beside it. So it's not just the Chinese and the Russians that are doing this, but it's also Britain, Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Korea. Any of the signatories to this are all here for not only for research reasons, but also for geopolitical reasons. And all of this is to create ambiguity and uncertainty regarding the legal status of the Arctic and of this particular archipelago. And Norway, in their 2019 and especially their 2024 position paper on the area, their white paper, said that their goal is to strengthen Norway's leadership role as a host nation. And they're doing a few strategies to do that. One is they're shifting researchers from standalone buildings. So rather than being a building for all the Chinese researchers, a building for all the British researchers, they're saying, no, this building is going to be a theme. Maybe this is meteorological work research. And everybody that does meteorological, regardless of your nationality, goes here. This one is ice flow work. And so everybody does that, they go in that building. So you can see what they're trying to do is delete the presence of researchers from particular nations, so you can no longer claim a space or a building as a mission or as sovereign territory. And the second thing they did, look at this image in the middle right here. This was always called the Ny-Ålesund Research Station, but they've now changed the logos to the Ny-Ålesund Research Station Norway on it. So it just sounds petty and minor, but it's all these little things that add up. They've increased the percentage of Norway researchers. They don't allow any new research facilities to be built. And they're allowing many more researchers from different communities so that they can play that coordinating role. So we're getting to the end of this, but let's look at the role of great powers. It's arguable that Russia is a great power now, but great powers. In 2018, China defined itself as a near-Arctic state. This image, if you see that red line, it emphasized that route through what may be at one point the Northeast Passage as the Polar Silk Road, and that was supposed to be the counterpoint to the Belt and Road Initiative in the south, that green line. And many of you might know about China's influence in trying to develop trade relationships and political influence and others with many nations along the Belt and Road Initiative. So they've defined themselves as a near-Arctic state. And so they're trying to extend their influence in the future, perhaps, through trade, investment, and political influence. And they're using the appropriate buzzwords for Svalbard. They're using words like cooperation, scientific research, but all of the institutions and many of the researchers are actually very closely associated with the state. In fact, China wanted, in the most recent meetings of the group, wanted there to be a new theme defined as social science related, because most of them are natural science related themes. So a social science theme would allow them to have political scientists there, and you can tell that therefore the research of political scientists might take an entirely different direction than the natural scientists' research. And there has been some questions raised about the legitimacy, the rigor of some of the research coming out of some of the scientists that go there, whether it's Chinese or others. So finally, let's look at this image here, just to give you some idea of the symbolism that sometimes takes place on the archipelago. This top left diagram shows over 100 Chinese tourists, including, you can see a woman in a People's Liberation Army uniform, who are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Yellow River Research Station in July of 2024, just last year. And they're all wearing matching red jackets and waving Chinese flags. So these are sort of these gray zone tactics, in this case by Beijing. And I was told when I read documents that local officials would not have allowed this if they had heard about it in advance, but it was planned almost spontaneously. So some of the future issues we have to look at, I've only looked at a couple of these now. Some of the future issues is, what is the future for bilateral relationships between Norway and the United States? And what role does the United States have to play in this area? Because they really haven't played as much of a role up to this point. And what about the multilateral organization? So for example, the Arctic Council was a body that was consisted of members from all of the Arctic and near Arctic areas, but there really hasn't been anything going on there since the Russian invasion in 2022 and even earlier than that. And finally, we have to ask ourselves the issue or question is, what is the American commitment to NATO in this area? Because if the American commitment to NATO in the area is perceived as being weaker, that may allow other nations, including Russia, to be emboldened. And that's all I'm going to give you today. I know I've overwhelmed you with stuff. I hope you've got a better appreciation of some of the issues taking place in this tiny little archipelago, and sort of you can read between the lines when you start walking the streets of Longyearbyen and the rest of the archipelago. My next talk is 2 days' time, and I'm going to talk about Norwegian aquaculture. It sounds like a boring talk, but aquaculture, and especially salmon, is incredibly important for Norway as an export for Norway. And you probably have seen, in fact, I was in a Costco in Canada recently, and I looked, there was a Norway frozen salmon sitting right in the shelf in Costco. So I'd love to talk to you about that, and I will in a couple days' time. So thank you very much. And I'll be at the back there if you want to talk to me.